All right, so the next unit that we're going to be taking a look at is the endocrine system. And the note packet for this is actually kind of on the short side, and that's because we're going to be doing an activity with an article that's actually going to help us to correlate the different glands that we're going to talk about today within the endocrine system with the hormones that they release and the functions of those hormones. So that's going to be a little bit more of a engaged activity rather than a lecture-based activity. Now, if we take a look at the endocrine system itself, it has two main functions: communication and control. And if we think back to the other systems that we have covered this semester, those functions actually very much parallel those of the nervous system. Now, normally we would say that that's not something that's going to exist, because there's really no reason why we would have two completely duplicate systems within an organism. So there has to be a reason as to why we have these systems that actually have the exact same functions. So if we contrast how the endocrine system works versus how the nervous system works, we see two major differences. First of all, the endocrine system is a slower operating system as compared to the nervous system, which operates very fast. The other one is that the effects of the endocrine system are very much longer lasting than the effects of the nervous system. And that, of course, ties in with the speed of response. So this is why we actually have in humans these two systems, because each of them occupies its own specific niche. So there's no overlap of actual activity. They're actually separate, independent systems performing their own specific functions. Now, if we look at the endocrine system, in terms of the generalized components, we have two main components within the system. The first one are the glands, and the glands are made up of groups of cells, specifically epithelial cells, and their job in the endocrine system is to produce hormones. So the second component are the hormones, which acts as the chemical messenger. It's basically like the message, the letter, so to speak, that gets sent. It is the method of communication. Nervous system uses electrical impulses. Endocrine system uses these chemical messengers that we call hormones. Now, if we think back to our first unit, we actually had two different types of glands that we discussed. So which glands exactly are we talking about? So let's review. The first type of gland that we have are the exocrine glands. And what makes them unique or different is that they secrete products into ducts that empty onto a surface or a cavity. So the cluster of gland cells in exocrine glands actually have a tube that leads away from them, that takes the product to that surface. Examples of exocrine glands include the salivary glands, which we will look at in the digestive system, and the sweat glands that we already looked at in the in the integumentary system. These are not the types of glands that are in the system. The type of glands that are in this particular system also share their name with the system. Those are the endocrine glands. So how are they different from the exocrine glands? These are ductless. In other words, there is no tube that takes the product from the secretion site onto a surface or cavity. What these glands do instead is when they produce their product, their hormones, they actually release it into the intercellular spaces. In other words, the spaces in between the cells, and eventually those products are going to make it into their bloodstream. Examples of endocrine glands are the pituitary gland and the thyroid gland. So if we look overall at the 10 glands that we are most interested in, here is the list: the adrenal gland, the hypothalamus, the ovary, the pancreas, the parathyroid, the pineal, the pituitary, the testes, the thymus, and the thyroid. Now, on the next page in your notes, you actually have this diagram. Okay, and normally I would have you use page 348 to label the endocrine glands on there. So just to help you with a little bit of review, I'm going to go back to this list, and what I'm actually going to do is show you which glands go with which numbers. So let me get my writing stylus set up here. Okay, it's not working. There we go. No? No. Oops. Okay. Should be working now. All right, so if you look at number 1 on the diagram, okay, that is, and that's still not writing, sorry. Let's see if I can get this. Let me try this again. Yep. So number 1 is the pineal gland. Number 2 is the hypothalamus, and number 3 is the pituitary. The pineal gland is posterior part of the skull. Hypothalamus is kind of the medial part of the brain, and the pituitary is anterior. You have to keep those positions straight so that you know the location of the 3 for, let's say, a test. Number 4 is the thyroid. It is the larger kind of butterfly-shaped portion of that gland, and there's smaller components which we will label when we get to number 10. Number 5 is the thymus. Number 6 are the glands that sit on top of the kidneys. We have 2 of them, right and left, and those are the adrenal glands. Number 7 is kind of what I call one of the schizophrenic organs of our body. It actually functions in 2 different systems, and that is the pancreas. The pancreas also functions within the digestive system, but we are specifically looking at its endocrine function in this system. Now, number 8 and 9 on your diagram get confused, and I kind of laugh because I've had more than one student not get 100 on this particular test because they flip-flop these 2. So please be careful. Number 8 are the ovaries, and number 9 are the testes. Please be careful with that. And that leaves number 10, which is our parathyroid. Okay, and those are the little subunits that exist on the thyroid gland itself. Okay. So that takes us through this diagram. Okay. So we have some vocabulary that we need to kind of go through in order to talk about actually how hormones work in general. And the first one we want to talk about is the target cell. A target cell in the endocrine system is a type of cell that actually has specific hormone receptors on the surface or in the cytoplasm. So what happens is the hormone will actually come in and lock in with those receptors. Not all cells have receptors for all hormones. So this way then only the cells that are supposed to be receiving the message actually get the message. What the binding does is it actually triggers biochemical changes within the target cell itself. We also have a couple of generalized conditions that exist with hormones. The first one is hypersecretion, and this is where we produce too much hormone. And then the second one is hyposecretion, which is where we produce too little hormone. Producing too much or too little can actually have serious consequences for a particular individual. So, and we've talked about these prefixes hyper and hypo before. So hyper means high and hypo means low. Okay, now if I take a look at the hormones that exist out there, we can basically subdivide them into 2 categories. The first category that we have are the steroid hormones. And so when you hear people talking about, oh, they're taking steroids, usually what they are taking is steroid versions of a hormone. Okay. What this means to be a steroid hormone is that they are lipid, in other words, fat soluble. So they will dissolve in fat. So they will stay within our fat tissue actually for a long period of time. But in terms of the cell, what that means is these types of hormones are actually able to pass through the cell membrane of the target cell. And so therefore the receptors are actually right within the cytosol or cytoplasm of the cell itself. Now, steroid hormones actually go and have a direct effect. So basically, they deliver their message straight to the DNA. There is no game of telephone that we're going to see a little bit later. Examples of steroid hormones include things like testosterone and estrogen. And the diagram that you have in your notes actually kind of models this. So this shape up here is a steroid hormone, and so you can see it's actually able to pass directly through the cell. You can see that the shape of the hormone matches the shape of the receptor, so what they combine, so the combination of the hormone and the receptor, when they come together, they form a hormone receptor complex. This complex is what is able to pass into the nucleus through the nuclear pores and actually have a direct biochemical effect on the DNA. It will cause it to, in this case, produce a new product, stimulate the cell to produce the new product, but certain hormones also will cause cells to actually cut off producing certain products. It just depends on the effect of that particular hormone. In this case, this hormone actually stimulates the DNA to make a product, a new protein, that alters how the cell actually functions. So that is how a steroid hormone works. In terms of the non-steroid hormones, their method is a little bit different. Non-steroid hormones are made up of full proteins or even just small chains of amino acids, not a full protein that's all folded. Now, because these are not made up of fats or fat soluble, they cannot pass through the membrane. So the receptors for these hormones are on the cell surface, not in the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, when these types of hormones bind with their receptors, their message has to make it basically like from the front door, so to speak, of the cell into the interior of the cell. But the hormone's unable to deliver that directly. So what they use is something called a second messenger. So basically they deliver the message to the door and another molecule actually finishes off the job. In most cells, this is called CAMP. The stands for cyclic adenosine monophosphate. This is a kind of a cousin of the ATP that we have in our cells that we use for cellular energy. The C means that the AMP is actually in a circle, and ATP has 3 phosphates, adenosine triphosphate, whereas this molecule only has 1, so that's why it's kind of a cousin. What this does, what this CAMP does, is it changes the enzyme activity. In other words, it finishes the delivery of the message of the hormone within the cell for the hormone. Okay. Examples of non-steroid hormones include things like epinephrine, TSH, which stands for thyroid stimulating hormone, and FSH, which stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and is actually used in the reproductive system of females. Now let's take a look at the diagram that shows how non-steroid hormones work. So we have a protein type hormone, okay, so that's a non-steroid, and notice that its receptor is here at the cell surface. So the shape of this hormone fits with the shape of the receptor. When they bind together, ATP, okay, we talked about how it was a cousin, changes into the CAMP, the cyclic adenosine monophosphate, and that is our second messenger. What it does is it goes and it changes the enzyme activities that affect the nucleus and then changes the cell function. So it's essentially the same outcome, it is just a slightly different way of having it happen. Okay, so in general, this is how hormones actually work. the first step is the hormone has to be produced by the endocrine gland. So the endocrine gland produces the hormone, but the hormone typically doesn't function at the site where that hormone is produced. So it goes to the capillary, because remember that is the only site of diffusion, and it is going to enter the bloodstream to travel through the body. As it travels through the body, it's actually looking for cells that have its receptor on it or in them. And when it reaches those cells, it goes to the target cell and it's going to bind with the receptor either at the surface or inside, depending on if it's steroid or non-steroid. Then what it will do is it will deliver its message to the DNA and alter the cell activities. So this is kind of our generalized overview of the endocrine system. And what we will be doing next is an activity that actually helps you correlate the different glands, so those 10 different glands that we looked at, the hormones that they produce, and then the functions of those hormones.